3 decades ago, I asked the coordinator of my grandmother's hospice care how she was doing. Not so much medically, kind of spiritually. And the coordinator said, respecting both my grandmother's confidentiality and my grief as curiosity, she said, "As we live, so we die." This was unfortunate for my grandmother, who barely topped 5 feet and intimidated the bejesus out of nearly everyone she met, including her progeny. She did this with her need for control and her insistence on rightness in the world. So dying was no easy path for her. Today, I want to tell you about a different older woman whom I also loved. I want to tell you about a different way to encounter dying and death. I want to tell you about someone who, when the time was right, couldn't wait to be the hummingbird. I want to tell you about Eleanor Lee Hawkins. So in the process of becoming a Unitarian Universalist minister, one must go before the daunting ministerial fellowship committee. And when I was preparing to go before that august group of people, the rumor on the street was that one of the possible questions would be to name a Unitarian or a Universalist or a Unitarian Universalist hero from each of the 4 past decades. Good question for someone who wants to become a minister. So I knew right away that I would name Lee as my 21st century choice. I tell you today about Lee as a talisman for myself, a gesture as part of my own spiritual practice of befriending death, my inelegant attempts to live in to the line from the reading that Jude spoke so elegantly, the tenderness yet to come. That poem is our reading today because Lee left instructions for me to read it at her memorial service in 2014. Lee was, indeed, that hummingbird. In 2004, a full decade before she died, when her husband was dying at home, he called out to Lee from the bedroom, "It's time." He told her he was at death's door, and Lee went to him full of devoted love. They had been married for decade upon decade, and they were still effervescent in their adoration for each other. And there she was, Lee, sitting on his bed, and she asked, true to herself and true to their marriage, "Raj, what's it like?" Minister or layperson, churched or so-called unchurched, organized or free range, death is the great leveler. And there is much for us to learn and gain and be enriched by stories of courage and acts of witness. So I am telling you about Lee because I want her witness in the world, dead as she is now, to enliven and expand our notions of what it is to be human in this aching world that always, without exception, ends in death. In this way, I make good on a promise I made to her to tell the story of her death and of her life. Born in California, Lee lived much of her life in Staten Island, actually, and she was active in the UU congregation there. For the last 20 years or so of her life, she was in Northampton, Massachusetts, where she and I were members of that congregation. As I understand it, for most of her adult life, Lee spoke of her intention to be aware and in control at the end of her life. Yes, documents, a will, advance directive, but conversations too with her family, Extraordinary medical interventions? No. Her vision of what would be a good life and also a good death? Yes. But control is the wrong word. It suggests the wrong meaning because she wasn't interested in controlling death, not in the way that we often experience it by trying to keep it at bay. I mean being in relationship with death, exercising control via surrender when the right time comes. This intention was part and particle of her deeply rational, deeply kind, deeply political being. And as she gained in years, having not succumbed to the vagaries and surprises and tragedies so many of us humans experience, she prepared for the possibility of dying of old age on her terms. And this impulse was not born of that depression that can sometimes accompany aging, which is often so much about all the losing that happens, right? The losing capacities, the losing friends, the losing out on experiences in the wider world. Though Lee was anticipating this, and eventually she began to experience it, and it informed some of the timing and texture of her choices. And while her choice was a private one that she shared with family and her closest beloveds, Lee was public about her plans. When the time came, and she didn't know exactly when that would be or how she would know it, but when it did, she would, quote, manage her own death, unquote. That's the phrase she chose to describe her actions, manage her own death, facing towards it, not away. She researched her options methodically and with intention about how her choice might impact her family and community. She made decisions in relationship with her adult children, not seeking their approval, but informing them and bringing them along, gaining eventually their assent. And in the end, at the age of 90, still without a terminal diagnosis, her body was beginning to weaken, and her mind was beginning to forget. So she figured out what she would do. She knew she did not want to do something violent. And ultimately, living in a state without death with dignity laws, she made it clear that when the time came, she would voluntarily stop eating and drinking. And so it was. 9 springs ago, Lee was living at home, and she found herself facing the reality that she might fall more often and likely lose her autonomy. And that June, I heard from a mutual friend, it was time. Like so many of us did at that time, there was an evening I brought dinner over. It was as if Lee had one of those old-fashioned dance cards, and it was filled for weeks and weeks, even though she had no appetite. She kept saying the best thing about being public about her plans was the ability to be able to say goodbye to so many people. That summer, I happened to be working as a hospital chaplain intern as part of that preparation for the ministry that all Unitarian Universalist ministers go through. And so while I was eating with Lee, I asked her if she would be interested in meeting with my clinical pastoral education peers and supervisor. You know, Lee had been a teacher for decades, and she jumped at the opportunity to do one last lesson. 7 of us from multiple faith traditions spent a few hours with her in her home, listening to and learning from a person choosing to encounter death with such intention. My favorite moment from that meeting came when Lee chided the 3 who hadn't spoken up. How could you miss an opportunity like this? She was impatient with their timidity. It was not long after our visit that Lee chose to stop eating and drinking. Surrounded by her 3 adult children, Eleanor Lee Hawkins died on September 2nd, 2014. Not many of us are ready for death. I'm not ready for death. Though it is my spiritual practice, it's focused on cultivating this capacity within me. But it does not much matter our readiness, our assent. Death comes. Wise people tell us that if we live our lives knowing that we are going to die, that we are in many ways always dying each moment, then our lived days will be fuller and more precious. It is a hard lesson to take in, but our very lives depend on it. I spent time yesterday at the Rubin Museum of Art here at their exhibit, Death is Not the End. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. It's a compelling comparison between Tibetan Buddhist and Christian depictions of various topics related to death. Amazing art there. Not everyone agrees with Lee's choice. That was true in the community that we shared. It's no doubt true here in this room. In Unitarian Universalism, there is no one opinion about what it is that makes a good death or where the laws should land when it comes to medical aid in dying, what we also call death with dignity. There is also a general impression that opinions about death with dignity fall along class and racial lines. There is a long-standing question for those of us who are ensconced in this about whether support for death with dignity is grounded in a privileged standpoint, centering especially on white educated persons. I want to share with you that data does show that there are higher levels of formal education of those who use medical aid in dying laws and the medicine that comes with it. And it is also true that such treatment, at least in New Jersey, is inaccessible to those with limited resources because health insurance does not cover it, even when it's legal. Yet I want to also share with you that there was a 2016 study exploring attitudes around death with dignity, and it concluded that the major influences on attitudes were not ethnicity, were not gender, but were actually religious affiliation and age. Support for access to death with dignity was about the same for white, Asian Americans, and Hispanic respondents in the mid-70% range, with a notable decrease for African American respondents, though still well above 50%. It was about 60% support. So whether you or I would make the same choices as Lee, I invite you to consider the invitation her choices extend to all of us, to bring intentionality to our lives by bringing intentionality to our deaths before they come, to hold conversations with those nearest us, to engage in a process of discernment about the end of life, about the end of your life, and then to share what you have learned with those nearest and dearest to you. I want to end with another UU voice who has blessed us with reflections upon her own death, the Reverend Nancy Schaefer. She was diagnosed with a brain tumor which eventually and far too soon took her life on June 5th, 2012. She kept a journal with the intention of having her reflections published posthumously, And they were in a book called While Still There Is Light. These are her words. This is not lost on me, given that I have a tumor that, I am told, will someday kill me. I have also the advantage that I must reflect now, while I am alive, on the meaning of my life and how I want to leave it. I might have died quickly. This is harder, perhaps, but exquisitely richer. I get to grieve my own self. How tender and not to be missed is this. May each of us be more able to face death, that of our loved ones, of our own. May we know peace and ease and perhaps the curiosity of a hummingbird. So be it. See to it. Amen.
Fall down on your knees, whisper to the trees, no one's come to save you. Little faith, little lies, sentimental cries, behold what nature gave you. All you see, every love and every dream, temporary, the morning dew will turn to steam. Battered by the years, we'll quit this veil of tears, leave the world to turn. The voice of midnight comes, it's spoken on its tongue, man's infinite concern. All you see, every joy and every sting, temporary as the blooming of the rose in spring. Live well and learn to die, soon in dust you'll lie, with everything you know. Cruel death will not spare, the wise, the young are fair. Let us drain this cup of woe. All you see is everything and every friend, temporary. Love you thought would never end. Every love and every dream, every joy and every sting, temporary as the lullaby your mother would sing. All you see is everything and every friend, temporary, love you thought would never end. Every love, every dream, every joy and every sting, temporary, the lullaby your mother would sing. Temporary as the lullaby your mother would sing.